Name is Kelly, and 5 years ago I met a man who changed my life. Tom. He was charming, confident, and seemed like a dream come true. When he told me about his son John, I took it calmly. He was 17 at the time, and I immediately set the boundaries. I wasn't going to play the stepmother role. It was an honest conversation, and Tom agreed. John moved in with his mother, which was fine with everyone. Life went on as usual. Our small, cozy family life filled with a familiar rhythm. I loved the quiet, the solitude, and our evenings for two. But a few months ago, something changed. John, now an adult, started showing up at our house more and more often. At first they were infrequent visits, easily explained by family occasions. But then his visits became unexpected. He would show up on weekdays when Tom was at work. It made me vaguely uneasy, but I tried not to dwell on it. That night was particularly memorable. I was cooking a romantic dinner. The air was filled with the scent of fresh herbs and roasting meat, the soft candlelight reflecting on the glass surface of the table. This was supposed to be a time just for Tom and me. I was immersed in my thoughts when I heard the sound of the door opening. My heart jumped. I expected to see my husband, but instead John walked into the kitchen. He was standing in the doorway, tall, reserved, with the same insistent stare I'd caught more than once before. His appearance took me by surprise, but I nodded, my emotions usually hidden, and continued chopping vegetables in silence. John sat silently at the table, his hands folded in front of him as if he were about to say something. His presence, silent but tense, hung in the air like a thunderstorm before the storm. I noticed the way he glanced at me from time to time, and then lowered his eyes again. It wasn't just a glance, there was something more to it, something difficult for me. I tried to concentrate on cooking, but his silence felt almost physical. Finally, I heard him take a deep breath, as if gathering his wits, but no words came out. Instead, he stood up abruptly, his chair creaking on the floor, and he walked out into the living room, leaving me alone. Left alone, I felt a heaviness building in my chest. What was it? I didn't know how to interpret his behavior. My mind tossed between irritation and anxiety. Maybe it was just youthful clumsiness? Or did he want to discuss something important but couldn't find the right words? I took dinner out of the oven and tried to get my thoughts in order, but the tension wouldn't let up. Finally, I went into the living room. John was sitting on the couch, staring at his phone. His shoulders were slumped slightly and his jaw was tense. He looked like a man struggling with internal conflict. He didn't raise his head, but I could sense that he sensed my presence. His reticence made me even more anxious. I didn't know how to proceed. Should I say something, make a point, or just leave him alone? The following days were saturated with silent tension. John kept coming, but something had changed. He avoided direct stares, and his movements became more stiff. I, too, began to keep my distance, trying not to be alone with him. But even in these attempts to distance myself, I felt his presence so keenly, as if we were in the same room, even if he wasn't there. Sometimes I caught myself listening for his footsteps or watching the door, waiting for him to come in. That invisible barrier between us grew more and more tangible, and the memories of that strange night never left my mind. His gaze, his hesitation, his tense figure, it was like a burn in my memory. I tried to distract myself, to get my life back on track. But every time John entered the house, I felt a strange wave of unease wash over me. These were the moments when the familiar comfort and peace of our home became as shaky as the sand beneath my feet. A week after that evening, I heard a light knock on the bedroom door. My heart quickened its rhythm again, and I felt a cold fear run down my spine. It was John. He stood in the doorway, his face expressing a mixture of determination and inner struggle. I noticed him take a deep breath before he spoke. I listened to his words, watching him try to express his feelings, to find an explanation for his behavior. He seemed lost in his own thoughts. The words poured through him heavily, like water through a dam about to burst. Although I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong, the unsettling feeling continued to haunt me. Silence took over the house like a thick fog, dense and inexorable. The evening hours dragged on, as if deliberately mocking my inability to lighten the mood. John sat tucked away on his cell phone. His figure, frozen in the semi-darkness of the room, as if out of time, only added to the sense of unreality. I walked into the living room, unable to bear my own indecision, and, raising my voice slightly, I blurted out, "John, what's the matter with you? Is there something you want to tell me?" He flinched, as if my words had plucked him from another planet. Then he looked up slowly, his eyes a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. The awkward pause dragged on until he whispered almost inaudibly, "Yes. Could you teach me? I've never tried," and his voice shook, and then he lowered his head, as if he himself was afraid of what he had just said. His cheeks flushed, and his gaze became even more uncertain. For a moment, I froze. Everything was boiling inside me: bewilderment, anxiety, anger. It was a moment when it was impossible to pretend like nothing was happening. But instead of snapping out of it, I felt myself on the edge of the abyss, from which came the call to make sense of the situation. "Teach you what?" My voice sounded sharper than I'd planned, but I needed to know. John stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back so that it creaked on the floor. "Forget it, it's nothing, I'm just sorry." He headed for the exit of the room, avoiding my gaze, but I didn't let him get away. "John, stop." His voice trailed off, but the words were firm. He stopped in the doorway without turning around. "If you want to talk, go ahead. Don't leave like that." He stood as if struggling with himself. His hands were nervously clenched into fists and his back was tense as a string. After that conversation, it was as if the house was no longer my sanctuary. Every sound, every step echoed in my mind. We hardly spoke at all, but this silence became a new form of communication, frightening and unbearable. It hung between us like a hot wire, ready to break at any moment. John came and went, but his presence remained, even if he was in another room. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was studying me, as if I were a character in someone else's drama. One night, when Tom hadn't come home from work yet, I came home later than usual. An eerie silence covered me like a cold blanket. John was sitting in the kitchen, engrossed in his phone. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and there was something strange in his gaze, deep, like a pool to fall into. I stopped in the doorway, trying to figure out what the sensation was tearing me up inside. Was it fear? Regret? I couldn't determine. But something told me that this night wasn't going to be the same as usual. "Are you still here?" My remark sounded irritated. He rose slowly from the table, his eyes never taking his eyes off mine. His movements were almost hypnotic, and the space between us suddenly seemed too tight. "I wanted to talk, but I don't know where to start," he finally said, and there was a heaviness in his voice. I felt a wave of ice run up my spine. "Then start," I said, trying to sound calm even though my heart was ready to burst out of my chest. His words, quiet and ragged, hit me harder than the loudest screams. He spoke of feelings he didn't understand, of how our encounters had pushed him to the edge of something inexplicable. He admitted that he'd always admired me, but now it had become something more. I listened, not believing my ears, feeling my resolve melt away. His words were dangerous, getting under my skin, making me forget that I had to keep my distance. "You know this is wrong," I whispered, trying to find my footing. "You're just confused." But his eyes burned with a strange light, and his breathing became ragged. "I may be confused, but this is reality." Those words hung in the air, and the room suddenly seemed too small. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All I could do was walk away. The rain outside the window rumbled like broken strings, creating a disturbing, almost musical background. My thoughts jumbled like leaves caught in the wind. I sat on the edge of the couch, trying to piece together scraps of logic and feeling. All I knew was that our life would never be the same again. My husband was gone, leaving behind a misunderstanding and an oppressive command: help him, make him learn to feel better. Those words echoed in my head, each repeated thought hitting my nerves harder than the last. I couldn't believe he wanted me to get closer to John. Just the way he'd hinted. The morning brought not relief, but a new wave of confusion. I heard the doorbell ring and slowly went to open it, feeling fear rise to my throat. John stood on the threshold, with a bouquet of lilies in his hands. His gaze was intense, but somehow pleading at the same time. "May I come in?" he asked, clutching the flowers in his hands. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I nodded silently, though my heart was racing with anxiety. He walked into the living room, carefully placed the flowers on the table, and without a word, stood right in front of me. I didn't know what to do, where to put my hands, where to hide from his gaze, which seemed to see right through me. Wanted to talk, he began, struggling to find the words. I need to understand what's happening to me. Can you help me? Please. He reached for my hand and, without waiting for permission, touched it gently. The gesture was timid, but it felt powerful. I recoiled, instinctively pulling my hand away, but he didn't pull back, his gaze sharpening. You have to listen to me, he continued. I don't know how to deal with this. These feelings, they're new to me. I can't control them. My lips quivered, and I couldn't find the words. My head was buzzing with questions. Why are you here? Why are you saying this? And, most importantly, why does your father approve of this? As if to confirm my worst guesses, he added quietly, I spoke to my father. He said you could teach me to understand myself. That it was okay. Those words broke the thin edge of my composure. My legs shook, my thoughts scattered, and only the pulse in my temples beat like a scream. Run. Get away from this, but I didn't leave. Instead, I watched him lean closer, his fingers touching my arm again, more confidently this time. The room became so quiet I could hear my own breathing. His gaze flickered, as if he were searching for approval, or even a sliver of hope. You want to help me, don't you? You won't leave me, he whispered. This is wrong, John, I said finally, my voice trembling. Do you realize what you're saying? I know, he said, looking away, but there's nothing I can do about it. He looked up, and in them I saw something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. There was a mixture of tenderness and desire. It was a look I'd seen before, but not in this context, not from him. My heart was breaking. I took a step back, stumbling over the edge of the table. John didn't move, but his presence filled the room. Finally, I inhaled sharply and said, You need to leave. Now. He stood motionless, as if my words hadn't reached him. Then, as if obeying an inner command, he slowly picked up the bouquet and held it out to me. I wanted you to know how important you are to me, my mind kept telling me. Don't take the flowers. Don't take them. But my hands reached out, as if against my will. I took the bouquet and, looking at his confused face, I could barely find the strength to say it again. John, go away. Please. But it was as if he didn't hear me. He took me with both hands and sat me on the table, the touch of his skin driving my mind crazy, but I just couldn't. He ran his strong hand over my face, touched my lips, and whispered quietly in my ear that he was ready to fulfill my every desire. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and just as he wanted to take off my robe, I could see his cheekbones clenching hard, as if he had already replayed the scene in his head. I pushed him away with my foot. He nodded, as if realizing he'd reached the edge. But before he left, he did something that left me utterly confused. He leaned over and touched his lips to my forehead. It was a brief, almost innocent gesture, but it left a searing mark. When the door closed behind him, I collapsed on the couch, wrapping my arms around my head. Tears rolled down my cheeks, and I whispered to myself that this was all just a nightmare from which I would soon awaken. But deep down, I knew it was real, and it was just beginning.